YouTube boxing has become one of the most popular trends over the last few years, and it doesn't seem like YouTube boxing is slowing down anytime soon. Even if you don't like watching YouTubers or content creators fighting each other in the ring, you gotta admit it's good for boxing viewership wise, and it's brought many younger fans into the sport. In today's video, we're gonna go over the good, the bad, and the ugly of YouTube boxing, trying to understand both the positives and negatives of the recent trend, and discussing how much longer YouTube boxing will be this popular. Let's get straight into it. Now, if you just look at the surface level of YouTube boxing, you might think it's all about KSI versus Logan Paul, but it actually started way back in 2017 with a man named Joe Weller. Joe Weller is a British YouTuber with over 5 million subscribers today, and even though he doesn't post a ton of videos nowadays, whenever he does post a video, it gets around 500,000 views. Going back 5 years though, Joe Weller posted a video boxing Theo Baker, another YouTuber, on August 2nd, 2017, and this video received over 7 million views. Many other YouTubers watched Joe Weller's video, and this is what started YouTube boxing. Now, this boxing match wasn't a professional fight at a sold-out arena like we've seen in recent years, but instead, it was two people at a gym with the referee and a cameraman recording the fight. It's honestly really interesting to look back and observe the snowball effect that followed, because if Joe Weller never posted this video, I doubt YouTube boxing would be where it is today or even exist. I think part of the intrigue around YouTubers getting in the ring was that you usually don't associate content creators with being very physically fit or being great fighters, so many of the YouTube boxing matches that took place later on were more about seeing your favorite influencer in the ring rather than actually trying to watch high quality boxing. Moving forward from the Joe Weller vs Theo Baker fight though, the next fight involving YouTubers would accelerate YouTube boxing to new heights. On the night of February 3rd, 2018, KSI, one of the most popular content creators on the planet, would face off against Joe Weller in an amateur boxing match. Both YouTubers took advantage of the fight by posting several videos hyping up the fight, and all these videos got millions and millions of views. Even though this wasn't a professional fight, it had an official press conference and weigh-ins, and overall, there was a ridiculous amount of hype heading into this event. This fight had a much larger audience compared to Joe Weller's first match, with 8,000 screaming fans in London, so there was definitely a ton of pressure for both of them. KSI was clearly the more dominant fighter, and he won the fight by way of knockout in the third round, and everyone jumped into the ring to celebrate with KSI. Even if the boxing quality wasn't great, it certainly takes a lot of courage to get in the ring in front of thousands of people in person and millions more online when you aren't even a professional boxer. This would be Joe Weller's last fight, but you definitely gotta show him some major respect, because you can't talk about YouTube boxing without mentioning his name, and he is the true pioneer of this when it comes down to it. After the fight, KSI gets on the mic and in true boxing fashion, calls out any future opponents that he wants to fight, mainly calling out Jake Paul or Logan Paul to be his next challenger, and just like that, YouTube boxing was officially a thing. The next event would be even bigger than KSI vs Joe Weller, with many more fights on the undercard this time around. The two most highly anticipated fights on this card were Jake Paul vs Deji, which was the co-main event, and KSI vs Logan Paul being the main event. All of these boxing matches took place on August 25th, 2018 in Manchester in front of 21,000 fans. Jake Paul ended up defeating Deji by knockout in round number 5, and the KSI Logan Paul fight ended in a draw, which left a lot of fans questioning the integrity of the fight. Many people speculated that they set up the fight to end in a draw so they could make even more money with the rematch. Now, there is no concrete evidence on whether this is true or not, but the fight was evenly matched either way. One of the main problems with watching these YouTube boxing matches was that they were pay-per-view, which means you couldn't just watch it on TV or online for free. Instead, you had to pay. Even though the fights only cost around $10, many of the people watching these fights were very young, so they might not be able to purchase the fights. There were a ton of people illegally streaming the fight on their YouTube or Twitch accounts, so many people were actually able to watch the event for free without having to pay the fee. Moving away from the actual fighting side of YouTube boxing for a minute, many people may be wondering why so many content creators would want to get in the ring if they aren't professional fighters. Well, I think there are a few different reasons why they might do so. Number one being they actually love boxing and want to put on a show for the fans, or the more realistic option, they want the clout and attention that comes along with the fight. There is a potential to make a lot of money from the YouTube videos you make leading up to the fight itself, and then making content after the fight. The viewership of KSI and Deji's YouTube channels skyrocketed before the fights with the Paul brothers, and it didn't matter if they won or lost these fights either, it was still good for them business-wise. KSI and Logan Paul would have their rematch on November 9th, 2019, and instead of this being another amateur boxing match, this was an official professional fight, which basically means there is no more headgear involved, and the fighters would wear 8-ounce gloves. Since this was a professional fight, there was no longer YouTubers fighting on the undercard, but instead, serious pro boxers that were extremely talented. There were two champions fighting below KSI and Logan Paul on that card, those fighters being Devin Haney and Billy Joe Saunders, who both defended their titles that night. The fact that two YouTubers can be the main event above two championship fighters shows that the interest was more about who was fighting and not necessarily the level of boxing. The hype for Logan Paul vs KSI 2 was massive, and the fight was very back and forth the entire time, but when Logan Paul ended in a legal punch, he got a 2-point deduction, which really hurt Logan's chance to win the fight. The fight went the full 6 rounds, and KSI ended up winning by a split decision. Now, the quality of the boxing wasn't terrible, but it obviously wasn't anything amazing, and a lot of these YouTube boxing matches have a ton of of clinching, and most fighters are just throwing power shots trying to get the knockout. A highlight video of KSI vs Logan Paul 2 got over 32 million views, which shows that people cared enough to at least watch the highlights. After this fight concluded, Jake Paul really started to ramp up his fighting schedule, and he helped carry the hype of YouTube boxing when not a lot of other fights were taking place in the YouTube scene. Jake Paul fought guys like AnEsonGib, Nate Robinson, Ben Askren, and also Tyron Woodley twice. Jake won all of these fights, and he knocked out almost all these opponents. Many people like to say that Jake Paul's fights are rigged, but I honestly don't think so. Jake Paul is definitely selecting his opponents carefully, making sure to not fight anybody above his level, but this does not mean his fights are rigged. The fight against Ben Askren was the most controversial, and people claim that Jake Paul paid off Ben Askren, but I don't believe this either. There is a massive difference between someone not giving it their all in training and the fight actually being rigged. Ben Askren was a former UFC fighter who is known for his wrestling, and boxing was obviously not his strength. Jake Paul fought Tyron Woodley as well, another former UFC fighter, and he ended up beating him by split decision in the first fight, but he would knock out Woodley during their second bout on December 18th, 2021. Since Jake Paul didn't fight any real professional boxers at this time, his actual level of fighting was unknown, but he will be fighting a real boxer named Hasim Raham Jr. on August 6th. Now, Jake Paul was trying to fight Tommy Fury for a very long time, but that fight kept on falling out, and I doubt we will ever see Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury. It's pretty incredible though how far YouTube boxing has come, considering Jake Paul is fighting a real boxer. I know a lot of people don't like the guy, but he's clearly putting in the work and taking boxing very seriously. Even though it was established that Jake Paul was a better boxer than Logan Paul got the opportunity to fight boxing legend Floyd Mayweather in an exhibition match on June 6, 2021. This fight was obviously all about the money for Floyd, but if someone told you back in 2018 that Logan Paul would box Floyd Mayweather, you definitely wouldn't believe them. The fight went the distance, and even though Mayweather certainly won the fight, there was no official decision because it was just an exhibition fight. Now, I know that I've been talking about the Paul brothers for a decent amount of time, but there still were a lot of other content creators getting in the ring that deserve some recognition. On June 12, 2021, a company called Social Gloves put together a YouTuber versus TikToker boxing event. Each fight would include one person that uploaded YouTube videos and one person that made TikToks, so all the fights had some sort of rivalry behind them. The actual fights during this event were great, with FaZe Jarvis knocking out his opponent Michael Lee in the second round. Deji was also fighting on this night, but unfortunately for everyone rooting for him, he lost to Vinny Hacker, who knocked out Deji in the third round. Deji looked exhausted near the end of the fight, and it was clear that his cardio failed him. Moving on to the main event of the card, Austin McBroom and Bryce Hall faced off, and despite Bryce Hall claiming he's been in over 40 street fights, he got completely outclassed by Austin, who knocked him out in the third round. Everything seemed to be going well for the event hosted by Social Gloves, but the real controversy wouldn't come until after all the fights finished, when multiple fighters were claiming they didn't get paid. Nate Wyatt and Taylor Holder, two people that fought in the YouTuber vs TikToker boxing event, both filed lawsuits against Social Gloves, and the whole thing spiraled into a disaster. The funny thing is that Austin McBroom actually owns Social Gloves, so even though he knocked out his opponent, he had to deal with a lot of backlash. The event didn't sell nearly as many pay-per-views as he was anticipating, and that's the main reason why he couldn't pay the fighters and the investors what he originally told them. Moving on from all the Social Gloves drama though, in March of 2022, FaZe Temper fought against fellow YouTuber King Kenny. Temper fought well the entire fight, but since nobody got knocked out, the official decision was in the hands of the judges, where they gave the victory to King Kenny. This caused a ton of outrage on social media because people felt that the fight was rigged against FaZe Temper, and the judges were not evaluating the fight fairly. Luckily for FaZe Temper though, he submitted an appeal and actually got the decision overturned, so he ended up winning the fight after all. I'm sure it was still frustrating for Temper though, because it ruined his initial moment of winning, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that didn't know the fight was overturned and still consider King Kenny to be the winner. Either way though, I'm glad the right decision was made, even though it took longer than expected. Moving into the present day, there are a bunch of exciting YouTube boxing matches on the horizon. Of course, I already mentioned the Jake Paul versus Hasim Raham Jr. fight, which will take place on August 6th, and will certainly be a massive test for Jake Paul. KSI will also be fighting later this summer on August 27th, facing off against YouTuber Alex Wasabi. Now, the other fights in the KSI card include King Kenny vs FaZe Sensei, Deji vs FuziTube, and FaZe Temper vs Blueface. I think there are a lot of things to like about YouTube boxing, but you also can't ignore some of the not so great things about it, like some of the fighters not coming in prepared, having the judges rig fights against them, and also the fighters not receiving their pay. I'm sure some people will claim that YouTube boxing is making a mockery of the sport, but I don't necessarily agree with that, and Mike Tyson, one of the greatest boxers of all time, said it's the biggest help for boxing in the history of boxing. As I said earlier, it's crazy to think about the snowball effect that Joe Weller had on YouTube boxing, and if he didn't post that one video boxing Theo Baker, who knows if YouTube boxing is anything compared to what it is nowadays. Make sure to drop a comment down below on whether you like YouTube boxing or not, and I'll make sure to get back to you. I hope you enjoyed this video on the good, the bad, and the ugly of YouTube boxing, and I'll see you all next time.